Across Europe, millions of people unknowingly carry a genetic imprint of an ancient past. Traces of Scandinavian ancestry are woven into the DNA of entire populations, shaping not only their genetics but their cultures, languages, and even physical traits. The Nordic influence is far greater than the Viking Age alone, stretching back thousands of years before their infamous raids and persisting long after. But how deep does this hidden legacy go? And what does modern science reveal about the unbreakable connection between Nordic ancestry and Europe's genetic makeup? The story of Nordic DNA isn't just about warriors and explorers. It's about migrations, settlements, and a profound genetic exchange that continues to influence Europe today. The earliest Scandinavians were not the Vikings we think of today, but ancient hunter-gatherers who arrived over 10,000 years ago. Over time, these populations mixed with migrating groups from the east and south, creating the genetic foundation of modern Nordic people. But their influence wasn't confined to the cold north. Centuries before the Viking Age, early Scandinavian tribes moved southward, merging with Germanic groups that would later spread across Europe. The Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, and other Germanic tribes that settled in Britain had deep Scandinavian roots, long before the Vikings set sail. These early movements ensured that Nordic DNA was already present in regions like England and northern France, even before the infamous Viking raids of the 8th century. When the Viking Age began, it was not just a military expansion, it was a genetic revolution. The Vikings didn't just pillage, they settled, intermarried, and left behind an enduring legacy in the DNA of the lands they reached. In Britain, studies reveal that up to 6% of the modern population carries Viking ancestry, with higher percentages in certain regions like Scotland and the Orkney Islands. In Normandy, France, the very name Norman means Northman, a direct nod to its Viking settlers. Even in Eastern Europe, Viking-descended Varangians played a role in shaping early Russian and Ukrainian states, further spreading Nordic lineage into Slavic populations. Modern genetics has confirmed what history suspected. Nordic DNA is not just a relic of the past. It is still present in millions across Europe. Advances in DNA analysis have allowed people to trace their ancestry back to specific regions, revealing how Viking and pre-Viking Scandinavian migrations left a lasting imprint. Some surprising results have emerged. Nordic genes have even been detected in parts of southern Europe, likely due to historical trade routes and mercenary activity. But this isn't just about genetics, it's about identity. Whether through surnames, cultural traditions, or even certain physical traits, the echoes of Nordic ancestry remain alive today. The languages we speak, the stories we tell, and even the way certain European societies developed can be traced back to these ancient connections. While most people may not think of themselves as having Nordic heritage, science continues to prove that the impact of those early Scandinavian migrations is far more widespread than anyone could have imagined. Long before the world knew of Vikings, the genetic foundations of modern Scandinavians were already taking shape. Thousands of years ago, before Norse mythology, longships, and legendary warriors, the lands of present-day Sweden, Norway, and Denmark were home to ancient hunter-gatherers and early farming communities. These early Scandinavians were among the first to adapt to the harsh northern climate, developing unique genetic traits that would later spread across Europe. But how did their DNA become such a dominant force beyond Scandinavia? The first known settlers of Scandinavia arrived over 10,000 years ago, soon after the Ice Age retreated. These early populations had genetic ties to both Eastern European hunter-gatherers and Western European farmers. DNA studies show that over time, migrations from the Eurasian steppes introduced new genetic markers, adding to the mix. This blending of different ancestral groups formed the distinct Nordic genetic identity that would later define the Vikings and other Scandinavian peoples. But the spread of Nordic DNA didn't start with Viking raiders. Long before the Viking Age, Germanic tribes with deep Scandinavian ancestry began expanding southward. Groups like the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, many of whom later settled in Britain, originated in what is now Denmark and northern Germany. They carried Scandinavian genes across Europe centuries before the first Viking longship ever set sail. This means that people in parts of England, Germany, and the Netherlands had Nordic ancestry long before the Viking Age even began. By the time the Viking Age arrived, Nordic DNA had already woven itself into the European genetic fabric. The Vikings, rather than starting this spread, continued an expansion that had already been in motion for centuries. Their voyages accelerated the genetic blending process, ensuring that Nordic lineage became an enduring part of European ancestry. Genetic research confirms these early migrations. Studies of ancient remains in Britain and Northern Europe reveal Scandinavian genetic markers dating back to the pre-Viking era. This suggests that the movement of Nordic DNA was not just the result of Viking conquests, but a much older phenomenon, one that began with prehistoric settlers and early Germanic expansions. This means that millions of Europeans today carry a genetic connection to Scandinavia, even if they don't have direct Viking ancestry. The legacy of Nordic DNA is not just about warriors and seafarers. It's about a deep and complex migration history that shaped the very foundation of European genetics. For centuries, the word Viking has conjured images of fierce warriors, longships cutting through the waves, and raids on distant shores. But the Viking Age wasn't just a period of conquest. It was a time of massive genetic and cultural exchange. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, Scandinavian seafarers didn't just take land and riches. They settled, intermarried, and left a genetic imprint that still exists in millions of people across Europe today. The Vikings set sail from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, reaching as far as North America in the west and the Middle East in the east. But their deepest genetic impact was felt in Britain, Ireland, France, Russia, and Eastern Europe. Unlike earlier migrations, Viking expansion was rapid, widespread, and deeply transformative. In Britain, Viking settlements were not just military strongholds. They became thriving communities. DNA studies show that up to 6% of the modern UK population carries direct Viking ancestry, with higher percentages in Scotland and Northern England. In places like the Orkney and Shetland Islands, the Viking genetic footprint is even more pronounced, with over 25% of the male population carrying Y-DNA markers linked to Norse ancestry. In France, the Viking presence was so significant that it gave birth to a new identity. The region of Normandy, literally meaning land of the Northmen, was granted to Viking leader Rollo in 911 AD. The Normans, descendants of these Vikings, went on to shape European history, most notably with the Norman conquest of England in 1066. Even today, DNA tests reveal Nordic genetic markers in parts of northern France, a lasting reminder of these early settlers. The Vikings also traveled eastward, navigating the great rivers of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. They formed the Kievan Rus, an early state that laid the foundation for modern Russia. Genetic studies confirm that the ruling class of Kievan Rus had significant Scandinavian ancestry, blending with local Slavic populations. Even in Poland and the Baltic states, traces of Viking DNA remain, proving their genetic influence extended beyond the Western world. One of the most fascinating aspects of Viking expansion is that it didn't always involve warfare. Many Vikings integrated into the societies they encountered, taking local wives and establishing trade networks that further mixed their genetics with other European groups. This was not just a wave of conquest, it was a wave of integration. Modern genetic research has traced specific Viking DNA markers in populations across Europe, confirming that the Nordic expansion was one of the most significant genetic dispersals in history. What began as seaborne raids evolved into lasting settlements, shaping the genetic and cultural identity of countless regions. Today, millions of people, whether in Britain, France, or Eastern Europe, carry the silent legacy of Viking ancestors in their DNA. The Viking Age may be the most famous Scandinavian expansion, but Nordic DNA had already spread across Europe long before the first longships set sail. For thousands of years, early Scandinavian populations moved southward, merging with Germanic tribes and influencing the genetic landscape of Europe. These forgotten migrations played a crucial role in shaping modern European ancestry, long before the Viking warriors made their mark. One of the earliest waves of Nordic genetic influence came from prehistoric Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, who lived in the region over 10,000 years ago. As agriculture spread from the Middle East into Europe, these northern populations mixed with early farmers from the south, creating a unique genetic blend that formed the foundation of modern Scandinavian DNA. But their journey didn't stop there. By the Iron Age, Germanic tribes, many of which had Scandinavian origins, began migrating across Europe. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who later played a massive role in shaping British history, originally came from Denmark and northern Germany. When they invaded and settled in England during the 5th and 6th centuries, they carried Nordic genetic markers with them. In fact, DNA studies on Anglo-Saxon remains show that many of them shared close genetic ties to early Scandinavians. This means that some regions of Britain already had significant Scandinavian ancestry centuries before the first Viking ships arrived. Further south, another powerful migration was taking place. The Goths, Vandals, and Lombards, Germanic tribes with deep Scandinavian roots, moved through Central and Southern Europe. The Goths, originally from Scandinavia, established kingdoms in Spain and Italy. The Vandals traveled as far as North Africa. Even today, traces of Nordic DNA can be found in unexpected regions due to these early migrations. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal how Scandinavian genetics were present in Europe far earlier than previously believed. In York, a study of Roman-era British remains found individuals with 25% Scandinavian ancestry, proving that Scandinavian migration to Britain occurred long before the Viking Age. Similarly, early Scandinavian influences in Germany and Poland show that Nordic DNA was already circulating throughout Europe long before the Vikings became a dominant force. This forgotten history of Nordic migrations challenges the idea that Vikings were the sole carriers of Scandinavian DNA across Europe. In reality, the genetic spread began long before the Viking Age, through trade, migration, and early conquests. Viking expansion only accelerated a process that had been shaping Europe for thousands of years. For centuries, historians have relied on ancient texts, archaeological finds, and linguistic clues to trace the movement of Nordic populations across Europe. But now, science has provided the most undeniable proof yet. DNA analysis has confirmed that millions of Europeans today still carry genetic markers linked to Scandinavian ancestry. Modern genetics has reshaped our understanding of history, revealing how deep the roots of Nordic DNA truly go. One of the biggest breakthroughs in genetic research came when scientists analyzed ancient Viking-era skeletons from across Europe. A landmark study, published in Nature, examined 442 Viking remains and compared them with modern DNA samples. The results? Vikings were far more genetically diverse than once believed, and their DNA left a lasting imprint on modern European populations. In Britain, genetic studies have found that up to 6% of the population still carries direct Viking ancestry, with even higher percentages in Scotland, Orkney, and northern England. The male Y-DNA haplogroup I1, which originated in Scandinavia, remains common in these regions, proving a strong genetic link to Viking settlers. Even in parts of Ireland, DNA tests show a significant Nordic influence, particularly in areas where Viking settlements thrived. In France, genetic markers confirm the deep influence of Viking settlers in Normandy. The Normans, who descended from Vikings, later spread their genes even further during the Norman conquest of England. Today, Nordic genetic signatures can still be detected in northern France, showing that the Viking influence was not just cultural, it was biological. Perhaps one of the most fascinating discoveries comes from Eastern Europe. DNA testing has confirmed that early rulers of Kievan Rus had Scandinavian ancestry, supporting historical accounts that Viking warriors played a key role in the foundation of Russian and Ukrainian states. Traces of Nordic genetic markers are still present in some Slavic populations today, particularly in regions historically connected to the Varangian traders and warriors. Advancements in personal DNA testing have allowed millions of people to discover their own genetic heritage. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA have identified Nordic DNA markers in people who never expected to have Scandinavian ancestry. Some individuals in Germany, Poland, and even Southern Europe have been surprised to find significant traces of Viking-era DNA in their results. This further proves that the spread of Nordic genetics was far more widespread than originally believed. The scientific evidence is undeniable. Nordic DNA is still a major part of Europe's genetic makeup. What started as ancient migrations, Viking expansions, and early Germanic movements has left a genetic legacy that continues to shape millions of people today. The past may seem distant, but for many Europeans, the proof of their Scandinavian ancestry is written in their very DNA. Nordic DNA didn't just shape the genetics of Europe, it transformed languages, traditions, and cultural identities that still exist today. Even for those who don't carry Scandinavian ancestry, the influence of the Norse world is deeply embedded in European societies, from everyday words to the way cities were built. The impact of Nordic migrations wasn't just genetic, it was cultural, and its legacy is still visible in ways most people don't even realize. One of the most lasting contributions of Nordic DNA is language. The English language itself has over 1,500 words of Old Norse origin. Words like sky, knife, window, egg, law, and anger all come from the Vikings. In places where the Norse settled, like Scotland and Ireland, many place names still reflect their Nordic past, such as Dublin, which was originally a Viking trading hub. Even in France, Normandy's very name means land of the Northmen, a direct reference to its Viking settlers. Beyond language, the legal systems and governance of Europe were also influenced by Nordic culture. The concept of trial by jury, democratic assemblies, and even voting systems can be traced back to early Norse practices. The Vikings were not just warriors. They were skilled merchants and administrators who helped shape trade laws and settlement structures. Scandinavian influence is also seen in architecture and city planning. The Vikings were master shipbuilders, but they also established well-organized urban centers. Many of the oldest European towns, particularly in Britain and Ireland, were originally Viking settlements. Cities like York and Dublin still contain Viking-era streets and archaeological remains that reveal their Norse foundations. Even physical characteristics tell a story of Nordic influence. While it's a stereotype that all Vikings were tall and blonde, genetic studies confirm that Scandinavian ancestry contributed to height and certain hair and eye color distributions in Europe. In regions with strong Viking heritage, like Iceland and parts of Scotland, blonde hair and blue eyes remain more common than in neighboring areas. Perhaps most surprisingly, even modern celebrations and traditions carry echoes of the Norse world. The idea of Yule, modern Christmas traditions, bonfires, and even certain wedding rituals have links to Old Norse customs. Some of the world's most famous stories, like J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, were directly inspired by Norse mythology and sagas. The Vikings and their ancestors didn't just leave behind DNA. They left behind a way of life that still exists in modern Europe. From the way we speak to the way we govern, from place names to physical traits, the legacy of Nordic DNA is more than genetic, it's cultural, and it's still shaping Europe today. For centuries, Scandinavians have been known for their resilience, endurance, and adaptability. But could Nordic DNA still influence physical and even mental traits in modern Europeans today? Science suggests that the answer is yes. The genetic legacy of Nordic ancestry goes beyond appearance. It may also play a role in how people respond to their environment, their resistance to cold, and even their personality traits. One of the most noticeable effects of Nordic DNA is on physical traits. While not all Scandinavians are blonde and blue-eyed, genetic studies confirm that a higher percentage of people from Scandinavian ancestry carry the genes for lighter hair and eye color. The spread of these traits into parts of Britain, France, and Eastern Europe is one of the most visible reminders of Viking and pre-Viking migrations. But the impact goes beyond appearance. Scientists have discovered that Nordic ancestry is linked to certain adaptations to cold climates. Some studies suggest that populations with high Scandinavian ancestry may have a genetic advantage when it comes to heat regulation and resistance to colder temperatures. This could explain why Northern European populations have historically thrived in some of the harshest climates. Even more fascinating is the potential link between Nordic DNA and certain personality traits. Research on genetics and psychology has found that Scandinavian populations tend to score higher on traits like independence, risk-taking, and resilience. These characteristics would have been essential for Viking explorers, who set sail into the unknown and adapted to new environments. Some scientists believe these traits have been passed down through generations, influencing the mindset of people with Scandinavian ancestry even today. Another interesting discovery involves pain tolerance and immune system strength. Certain genetic markers found in Scandinavian populations have been linked to higher pain tolerance and resistance to certain diseases. This may have been an evolutionary advantage for early Nordic populations who lived in extreme environments and had to endure physical hardships. However, it's important to remember that genes are only one part of the story. While DNA may influence physical and mental traits, culture, environment, and personal experiences play an even bigger role in shaping personality and behavior. The idea that Viking ancestry makes someone more adventurous or physically resilient is fascinating. But science is still exploring how much of this is genetic and how much is learned over time. What's undeniable is that Nordic DNA has left an imprint on millions of people today, not just in their ancestry, but in their physical and possibly even psychological traits. Whether it's resistance to cold, a love for adventure, or even just the color of one's eyes, the legacy of Nordic genetics continues to influence the world in unexpected ways. Scandinavia may be geographically separate from the rest of Europe, but genetically, its people have always been deeply connected to the continent. From ancient migrations to Viking-era expansions and even modern population movements, Nordic DNA has never been confined to the north. It has continuously mixed with the rest of Europe, shaping genetic relationships that still exist today. But how closely are modern Scandinavians related to the rest of Europe? And what does genetic research reveal about these connections? Despite their strong cultural identity, Scandinavians are not an isolated genetic group. Studies of modern DNA confirm that Swedes, Norwegians, and Danes share significant genetic similarities with populations in Germany, the Netherlands, Britain, and even parts of France. This is the result of thousands of years of migration and intermixing, from the early Germanic movements to the Viking settlements across Europe. One of the strongest genetic connections is between Scandinavia and the British Isles. Because of centuries of migration, war, and trade, modern Brits and Irish people still carry noticeable Scandinavian genetic markers. This is particularly evident in northern England and Scotland, where Viking ancestry remains especially strong. In fact, DNA testing companies often group British and Scandinavian ancestry together due to their overlapping genetic history. Germany also shares a deep genetic link with Scandinavia. Many early Germanic tribes, such as the Angles and Saxons, originated in what is now Denmark in northern Germany, meaning their descendants in modern Germany still retain strong Nordic genetic markers. Even in the Netherlands, where Norse traders and settlers once traveled, genetic studies show that Nordic influence remains embedded in the Dutch population. But one of the most surprising genetic links is between Scandinavia and southern Europe. While it may seem unlikely, DNA evidence has confirmed that some populations in Spain and Italy carry traces of Scandinavian ancestry. This is largely due to the Viking presence in southern Europe, particularly the Normans, who descended from Vikings and later conquered parts of Sicily and southern Italy. This mixing of populations ensured that even in unexpected places, traces of Nordic DNA remain. What does this mean for modern Europeans? Simply put, Scandinavian ancestry is far more widespread than many people realize. Whether through early migrations, Viking settlements, or later movements, the genetic legacy of Scandinavia is still present in millions of Europeans today. Even those who don't identify as Scandinavian may be carrying a genetic connection to the north without even knowing it. For centuries, people have passed down stories of Viking warriors and Scandinavian explorers. But today, modern science allows us to go beyond family legends. With the rise of DNA testing, millions of people have discovered surprising connections to Nordic ancestry, some in places where Viking influence was never expected. But how can you find out if you carry Nordic DNA? And what signs in your genetics, surname, or family history might hint at a Scandinavian past? The most reliable way to trace Nordic ancestry is through genetic testing services like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and MyHeritage. These companies analyze your DNA and compare it to reference populations to determine where your ancestors likely came from. If you have significant Scandinavian ancestry, your results may show percentages linked to Norway, Sweden, or Denmark, as well as regions heavily influenced by Viking migrations, such as the UK, Ireland, Normandy, France, and even Eastern Europe. One of the strongest genetic indicators of Scandinavian ancestry is the Y-DNA haplogroup I1, which is passed down from father to son and is most common in Scandinavia. If a male relative has taken a Y-DNA test and falls into this haplogroup, it could suggest a direct paternal line to Norse or pre-Viking Scandinavian ancestors. Similarly, certain mitochondrial DNA markers, passed from mother to child, can also point to ancient Nordic origins. Beyond DNA, family surnames can sometimes reveal Scandinavian roots. Many Norse surnames ended in son or son, meaning son of, such as Anderson, Eriksson, or Johansson. However, because surnames changed over time, this isn't always a reliable indicator. Place names and old family records can also provide clues. If your ancestors came from regions with strong Viking influence, like Scotland, Orkney, Normandy, or Eastern England, there's a higher chance of Scandinavian heritage. Physical traits, while less precise, can also sometimes reflect Scandinavian ancestry. Blonde hair, blue or green eyes, and a tall stature are common among people with Nordic roots. However, Vikings were genetically diverse, and many carried darker hair and eye colors due to intermixing with other European populations. Historical research is another key way to trace your Nordic connections. If your family has records of seafaring ancestors, connections to known Viking settlement areas, or Scandinavian-sounding place names in their homeland, these could be additional signs of Viking or pre-Viking ancestry. Church records, census data, and even medieval tax rolls sometimes reveal early Scandinavian settlers in unexpected places. Ultimately, the best way to uncover your Scandinavian heritage is by combining genetic testing, family history, and historical research. Even if your DNA doesn't show a large percentage of Scandinavian ancestry, that doesn't mean your lineage wasn't influenced by Nordic migrations. The impact of Nordic DNA is far greater than a percentage on a chart. It's woven into the genetic and cultural history of Europe, making its mark on millions of people today. From the frozen landscapes of Scandinavia to the far reaches of Europe, Nordic DNA has shaped the continent in ways few could have imagined. What began as ancient migrations and Viking expansions has left a genetic and cultural legacy that still exists today. Whether through language, physical traits, historical records, or even personal DNA tests, the impact of Scandinavian ancestry is undeniable. Modern genetics has proven that millions of Europeans still carry traces of Nordic DNA, even in regions where Viking presence was once thought to be minimal. From Britain to France, from Russia to Italy, the genes of the ancient Norse continue to live on. But beyond the numbers, Nordic heritage isn't just about genetics. It's about history, culture, and the deep connections that link the past to the present. For those curious about their own ancestry, the best way to explore your Nordic roots is through DNA testing, historical research, and understanding the broader migration patterns that shaped Europe. Whether you find a Viking warrior in your family tree or a distant Scandinavian connection, one thing is certain. The Norse left a permanent mark, and their legacy is still being uncovered today. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the influence of Nordic DNA, let us know in the comments. Do you have Scandinavian ancestry? Or have you ever taken a DNA test? Share your thoughts. Hit that like button, and subscribe for more history and genetics content. There's still so much more to uncover.